My family and I used to live in a rough neighborhood when I was a kid. One night, it was just my mom, my two siblings, and I at home, and my dad was gone on a business trip. Around midnight, someone started knocking on our door. My mom woke up, went to the front door, and asked who it was. No one answered. She thought that maybe it was some kids playing ding-dong ditch, so she went back to bed. About 30 minutes later, again, someone starts knocking. She gets up and peers through the side window to see if she can spot anyone out there, but nobody is there. She starts to worry, so she goes back to the room, grabs my dad's double barrel, and sits in the living room in the dark, waiting. Then, more knocking. My mom begins shouting at whoever it is that she is going to call the cops and that if anyone tries to come in, she would shoot them. At about 2 a.m., the police finally show up and do a quick search outside of our house while we waited inside. After their search, they tell my mom that they had found a piece of barbed wire about 4 feet long next to the front door and asked if it belonged to my mom. She said that it wasn't hers and asked why. The cop told her it belonged to whoever was knocking on the door, that they were planning on strangling my mom with the barbed wire when she opened the door to see who was knocking. They said that she was very smart to not open the door to see who was there, otherwise it could have cost her life. The cops said that they'd patrol the neighborhood until morning and do a thorough investigation once there was daylight. That morning, as they were searching around the house, they found footprints leading around to the back of the house and up to my bedroom window. They had also found nicks in the window sill where the person was trying to pry it open to break in but failed. My mom always suspected it was this one neighbor because he would always stare at my mom through his curtains and wasn't very friendly. He also knew when my dad wasn't home, since he knows what vehicle he drives. We moved out of that house after that. When I was in high school, there were a few disturbing occurrences in my neighborhood. A woman down the street who lived alone woke up one night to go to the bathroom and heard her TV on in the living room. So she naturally wandered in there, assuming nothing out of the ordinary. She found a guy sitting on her couch, watching the TV, started screaming, obviously terrified, and the guy ran out of her house. Maybe a week later, further down the street, there was a family with a young daughter. She woke up in the middle of the night with her bed sheets pulled down and a guy tickling her feet. Again, started screaming, and the guy fled. Another week or so later, 3 houses down where an elderly couple lived, the husband woke up in the middle of the night to find a man standing over his bed and staring at his wife sleeping. The old man started hollering at the guy, and the guy fled again. Cops patrolling regularly. They somehow figured out who it was, and everyone in the neighborhood got a flyer with his picture. Behind us was a densely wooded area that stretches for a couple of miles in every direction. This guy had been literally living in those woods for upwards of a month in a tent, doing God only knows what when he wasn't breaking into houses. But the creepiest part of the story is this. One night in the middle of all these incidents, we had our sliding glass door open with just the screen door behind it shut. This was in the summer. We had a big backyard, and it was pitch black back there at night. Our dog suddenly jolted up and started growling viciously, like I'm talking tail stiff as a board, hair on his neck standing up. He never did that. So naturally, we were like, what the fuck? My father jumped up and put the floodlight over the deck on to see what was back there. But there was nothing. The next morning, we were outside doing yard work and noticed the lock on our back gate was broken. Someone had clearly done it. It wasn't like it was wear and tear or something like that. It's very safe to assume that this guy had tried to get into our backyard, but was deterred by my dog's growling. My dad lives in an apartment, and one day he came home to cops outside of his door. It was very early, 5 o'clock or 5:30 a.m. They asked if they could ask him some questions, and my dad said of course, invited them in, and made them breakfast. They asked him some questions about his neighbor across the hall. Just general stuff like, have you noticed anything weird? My dad told him no. He looks like a well-put-together, 30-year-old businessman. My dad lives in higher-end apartments, so this is what everyone looks like. Nothing weird or out of the ordinary. The cops go on to explain that a 30-year-old woman is missing and was last seen by a security camera walking into the building with this man. But they never had any footage of her, or him for that matter, leaving the apartment. The cops stay outside and monitor the apartment until about 5 p.m. that night when they finally get a warrant. They notice a shower curtain missing and golf clubs scattered on the bedroom floor. They end up arresting the guy. Fast forward 3 weeks, and the cops find her body about 45 minutes south in the woods on the side of a bike trail. Some runner stumbled upon her. Nothing more was released on what state she was in. Then about 2 months ago, they found more tapes as the investigators went back to look at them. They discovered the man leaving the apartment with his golf bag. But like I said earlier, all of his clubs were in his room. I'm sure many people have put 2 and 2 together. A full-size woman wouldn't fit in a golf bag, but that's how he got her out. His trial is coming up. As of right now, he claims it was an accident and he panicked and tried to hide it since he had a girlfriend. I didn't really talk to him, but I'm pretty sure he did something to his wife and 2-year-old daughter. When I met the wife, I was maybe 10 or so. She was really sweet. The husband, however, was kind of sketchy. He had a very expensive car, and the only thing he would ever do was drive or wash it. Once, my friend and I were playing around outside in mid-June, and he started to pull out of his driveway. My friend jokingly yelled out, "Why do you drive around so much?" He replied, "Because driving is the only thing to do in this piece of town," and sped off, but not before flipping us off. A couple of months later, the police came knocking. They asked my mom if she knew anything about the neighbors, said that he and the wife had supposedly gotten divorced, and asked if we knew the whereabouts of his wife and kid. We said no, and they told us that apparently the wife ran away and they couldn't track down the daughter. The only thing we knew about the wife was that she had a 2-year-old, was maybe pregnant, and that she drove a white Jeep. A couple months later, the husband was cleaning his car, and my mom and I were leaving for an appointment when my mom noticed the white Jeep in the garage. If the wife had run off, then wouldn't she have taken the Jeep? The dude saw that my mom had noticed the white Jeep, and a couple days later, he sold it. At one point, we had gotten a package for them delivered to our house, so we went to return it. His house smelled like pot and the deceased, and we saw a gun on the dining room table. I really hoped that it was a misunderstanding or something, and that the wife took the kid and ran as far as she could. I lived below a guy in his late 40s who was quiet and easygoing when he was there alone, but his annoying family was there at least half the time. Unfortunately, we shared a staircase, and they had to go by our door to get to his. The easiest to deal with was his sister, who would knock on our door and ask to use our phone, bum a cigarette, or to get a glass of water. It was always something. We'd politely remind her that her brother lived just up the stairs, so she should ask him for the things she needed. Far worse were his 2 brothers. One of them would show up at all hours and ring our doorbell to let him in if our neighbor wasn't home. Once, he rang it about 10 times in the middle of the night, and when I went to the window to yell at him to go away, he had the police with him, who asked us to let him up. I just wanted to sleep, so I opened the door. After that, We disabled our own doorbell and just asked our guests to call us when they arrived and warned them to watch out for anyone sketchy who tried to enter after them. The other brother would show up whenever he felt like it, open all the windows, and watch TV or listen to music at top volume for hours. Whenever all the siblings were together, they would get drunk and scream at each other and sometimes knock furniture over, also with the windows and doors open. Any attempt to ask them to be quiet or at least shut the windows would result in horrible insults shouted at you. In the mornings after the chaos, our neighbor would be terribly apologetic and promise his family wouldn't come around anymore. And of course, they'd be back the next week. The neighbor worked for the landlord, so not much was done about him. We got out of there as soon as we could. We were halfway through our one-year lease when these neighbors moved into the building next to us, and we had to start sharing the alleyway with them. They were constantly taking things off of our deck and patio and using them. Their apartment didn't come with an outside sitting space, so they'd put chairs and junk right in the middle of the alleyway, blocking everyone's access to the building's trash cans. They stayed up all night, screaming and crying and having drama. They'd have shady characters stay with them who would lurk around our building. My fiancé is a recovering heroin addict, and they kept offering him drugs. That's when I got really pissed. After repeatedly asking them to move their junk from the alleyway, they put out cameras and threatened us not to touch anything or move their stuff out of our way. Then, they broke into our apartment when we were in the middle of moving. They ripped shelving from the walls and took literally everything they could, including my jewelry collection, which had taken me 35 years to curate and contained gifts from loved ones and priceless family heirlooms. The police didn't have enough evidence to do anything to them. I hope karma gets them in a big way. I live in a small cul-de-sac in the middle of nowhere. The next nearest neighborhood is over 4 miles away. One night a few years ago, we got over 1.5 feet of snow overnight. So far from main roads and on the weekend, I knew our roads will remain unplowed for quite some time. I went on my out back deck door to look at the snow-draped trees and the still heavily falling flurries and take some pictures when I noticed footprints leading to my door, then turning around and leaving. I looked and saw that they came from my neighbor's side and thought that one of their more delinquent kids played a joke as my sledding tube on the railing was popped. I decided I'd wait till later as it was early to call their parents. I went on Facebook and after scrolling for a bit, I noticed one of my neighbors closer to the entrance posted, "Did someone knock for me or something at my back door?" I immediately called her, talked, and told her I have an idea. I called the first house on the entrance and told him what was going on. He went and checked, and sure enough, they were there too. Everyone started calling everyone else. I called the family at the far end, and they told me there was none there. Then I got a call from my next-door neighbor. She called the woman that lives next to the end house. She said that there were footprints that led to her door, but none led away. We already called the police by this point, but now we called them back and said that it's an emergency now. They told us the roads are still all unplowed and they can't send a plow truck to clear the way as they're a privately owned company. The woman was losing it, so one of the husbands, huge bear of a man, across the road from her texted her to say he was coming over to invite her over. He came and she left. We put up one guy's live feed motion recording hunting cameras facing all exits. Nothing came out. Around 7 p.m., a plow truck came as well as 3 cop cars. The couple she was staying with and her went to her house and stood in the doorway as the police searched. They found nothing. She begged them to keep looking, so they did. 2 of the cops went into the basement again. This time only one came up. He took her to the side room, and we could hear hysterical crying. By now we are all out there. Me and a few of the other guys started towards the door when several police confronted us. They told us they found someone hiding under a cover opening in the stairwell that she didn't even know existed. A few minutes later, a scruffy man screaming and kicking came out in cuffs and was led away. In his little campout, they found blankets she just cleaned and put away in the room next to hers. She stayed in other people's houses for a long time before going back. Even then, she wouldn't stay alone. She sold the house the next summer. He turned out to be a thrill-seeking junkie who was on probation for assault against a family member. The cops told us that they feel like he didn't want to stay at his apartment after a fight with his roommate and drove off in his roommate's car from the county over and got stuck in our unplowed roads. And that is why you always make sure you lock your doors. I've been flying for almost 30 hours and the flight attendants won't stop crying. 30 hours ago, I hopped on a late-night flight from New York heading to Los Angeles. After boarding, I saw that I had an entire row to myself. Takeoff passed without incident, and soon I was stretched out for a nap across the row. I slept for a few hours. I don't know how long, but I woke up to some severe turbulence. It's possible that the lights in the cabin went out for a moment, but I was so disoriented that it's hard to say. I checked my phone to see that it was 4:03 a.m., which I figured gave me about an hour until we landed. When I looked out my window, I was shocked to see nothing but wide open ocean. My jaw dropped. There's obviously no ocean between New York and Los Angeles. I hit the button to call the flight attendant and spent the next few minutes racking my brain for a lake that could have possibly been big enough to explain what I was seeing. I jumped when the attendant flipped off the light. She was grinning from ear to ear, and tears were pouring down her cheeks. "How can I help you, sir?" she asked. I froze for a moment at her reaction before deciding to just ask my question. "Where are we? Why does it look like we're flying over an ocean?" She wiped her cheeks to clear the tears, still grinning wildly. "Sir, we'll be landing in about an hour." Okay. "Thank you," I said. After she left, I checked the clock on my phone again. 4:03 a.m. blinked back at me. It hadn't changed. I had to have been waiting with my call light on for at least 5 minutes. How was it possible that it hadn't changed at all? I opened up my laptop and saw it too displayed 4:03 a.m. I pulled out my phone, started a stopwatch in the app, and spent the next 2 hours looking back and forth between the clocks, waiting for them to change. They never did. I tapped the shoulder of an older woman sitting in the row ahead of me. She looked back, an annoyed expression across her face. "Yes," she asked. "Do you know how long until we land?" I asked. She narrowed her eyes. "That flight attendant said it would be about another hour." I shook my head in confusion. "That flight attendant? We talked almost 2 hours ago. We should have landed already." She stared at me as if I was crazy. I was going to continue trying to convince her, but I felt a hand on my shoulder. I spun to see a male flight attendant grinning down at me, tears pinging off his cheeks onto my shoulder. "Sir, I'm going to ask you to calm down, or I'll be calling the captain." I told him that wouldn't be necessary and sat back. He removed his hand and stepped away. The flight attendants continued to stop by every few hours offering meals. My stopwatch continued to tick up and is now telling me that I've been on this plane for more than 30 hours. I've explored all of coach and tried talking to some of the other passengers, but they've all told me that they're expecting to land in an hour or so. Around 3 hours ago, I tried getting into first class. I made it past the curtain but was escorted back by 2 grinning flight attendants. Their grip on my arms were like iron. "Sir, the seatbelt sign is on," one said. "Please remain in your seat with your buckle fastened. We'll be landing in about an hour." I'd just about given up hope when a woman came down the aisle dressed in a business suit. She didn't look at me or slow down, but she dropped a piece of paper onto my tray as she made her way to the bathrooms at the back of the plane. I shot a look around before unrolling it. It said, "Are you stuck too?" I pulled out a pen and wrote, "Yes. It's been 30 hours. I folded the scrap of paper up and set it on the tray closest to the aisle. She left the bathroom and picked it up as she passed. It's been 20 minutes since then. I don't know why, but I don't think the flight attendants would like it if they knew we were talking." When I was too afraid to fall asleep one night, my dad, in his matter-of-fact way, told me to just wait it out and see who they really were. When I had the dream a couple days later, I didn't try to wake myself up like usual. I just waited to see who they were. I didn't resist, just let them reach towards me. I don't remember this next part, but both of my parents told me the story later when I was older. They both woke up at the same time around 1 in the morning, with the urgent feeling they needed to check on me. When they went into my room, I was lying in the middle of the floor, dead asleep, with my mouth open like I was trying to scream. I felt hot when they picked me up, and when they took my temperature, I had a ridiculously high fever. They took me to the ER, and the nurse said if they hadn't brought me in, I might have had lasting damage or even died. They said my fever was so high, if I hadn't gotten the medical treatment when I did, the heat might have begun to kill my cells. Who knows what state I would have been in by morning. They never figured out what caused it, and they wrote it off as some medical anomaly, sending me on my way. I haven't had the dream again since. I wish that was the scariest part of the story, but it's not. I strangely managed to forget all about it until very recently. My great-aunt has dementia, and so my whole family has been helping her clean out her house before she moves in with my aunt and uncle. I was talking to her one day, and she kept repeatedly asking me to grab the photo albums in the hole in the wall behind the horses. I wasn't sure what she was talking about, but she seemed so distressed that I decided to follow her instructions. I went to her bedroom, where there was a big painting of horses hanging on the wall. I checked behind it, and lo and behold, there were a couple photo albums. I brought them to her, and we started to look through them together. She started pointing at a picture of a teenage girl, calling her Catherine, and then pointing at me. My grandmother is long dead. She died during childbirth. As far as I can tell, she had no connection to any of this. And as far as I knew at the time, my great-aunt had no other siblings. But there they were, posing for a family picture with my great-grandfather and great-grandmother. My name is not Catherine, so I had to remind her who I was. I didn't think much of it, because she often calls people by the wrong name. But then I looked at the picture. This girl looked exactly like how I did at her age. I imagined she would have looked just like me at any age. I asked what happened to her, and for a minute it was like my great-aunt was fully back with me. She said she died of a fever given to her by the smiling, shape-shifting devil who haunted her dreams. I tried to ask more questions, but all she said was that the devil got her. He likes the blonde ones. The girl in the picture, Catherine, and I are the only natural blondes in my whole family. Unfortunately, my aunt had a stroke a couple of days later which left her unable to speak, so I never got to ask her any more questions. But I still wonder about Catherine sometimes, and what could have happened to me if my parents hadn't woken up that night. I like to think that it was the ghost of Catherine, making sure no one else died from the dreams. But I'll never really know anything more about the dreams or Catherine, and I guess I'll have to live with that. I've always felt that something has followed me from each place I've lived. Just weird little experiences. One night I was home alone in middle school, upstairs in my room when the power went out. In short, the power went out and I decided to sit on my bed and wait it out, When a couple minutes passed and nothing happened, I got up to go downstairs, and when I got to my doorway, I heard a loud scratching, like claws, going across the wall of the small office that was right across from my bedroom. We didn't have trees around the house, so nothing could have made noises by brushing up against the house, and never an issue with rodents. Before that, when I would have friends stay over, we would sleep downstairs so we could watch cable on the TV, and I remember one time where we just sat and listened to footsteps walking around upstairs. Everyone else's room was downstairs, and the stairs were right next to the living room, so it would have been obvious if someone went up there. In my first college apartment, I would always hear this clicking noise coming from the corner of the room when I was trying to fall asleep. It happened all of the time. It almost sounded like a hair straightener just being opened and closed. It would only stop if I sat up in bed suddenly. I've never felt super uncomfortable or uneasy anywhere, and I know noises can come from a lot of different things, but all of the weird things I've experienced have been, in my mind, unexplainable. But I've also had good experiences that I believe were signs from loved ones. When my beloved grandma passed, we had a rosary ceremony at our church. She was a devout Catholic. She had gifted me one blessed by Pope John Paul II. I was determined to find it when I got home so I could use it. I had boxes everywhere at home still, yet when I went to look for it, I picked a specific box and found it immediately. It could have been luck, but I'd like to think she guided me to the exact right spot. So this was around 2010. The internet was new to me, and video calls were the shit among my friends during those days. One day, one of my friends called me on Skype, and we spoke about stupid things that I can't even remember. Suddenly, my friend froze for a second, but the video wasn't interrupted. After some seconds, he asked, "Who's the person behind you?" I didn't turn to look because I thought that he was playing a lame-ass prank on me. But I asked him to describe the person, and he said that it was a boy of around 10 to 12 years, wearing a red t-shirt. He kept on asking me to look behind me, and I finally did. However, as expected, there was no one there. It has been almost 10 years, and he still maintains that there was someone behind me. After a few days, I started feeling uneasy around the table that my computer was on. I would feel something rubbing my foot from beneath the table, but I thought of rats and tangled wires as the explanation for it. After a few weeks, my mother said that she had been noticing stuff move in the kitchen by themselves. I didn't believe her until, one day, I saw a glass move by itself. It was clinking like something was stuck inside it while it was upside down. However, I didn't think of it much. After some days, I started to see some women in white around my bed at around 2 a.m. It could have been sleep paralysis. Once, my bua, aunt, told me that something had also touched her feet beneath the computer table. Finally, my grandmother decided to cleanse the house, and I haven't noticed anything suspicious since then. I am not superstitious, but I saw what I saw. Years ago, my now husband worked for an industrial laundry company in their head office when a PR disaster happened that also mentally screwed up a number of people. Their company collected laundry from large hospitals and medical-type businesses, e.g. care homes, etc., and cleaned them. You can imagine the sort of heavy-duty cleaning, bleaching, boiling, etc. needed to remove those sort of biological contaminants. One day, a laundry cart went through the usual bleaching, boiling cycle before it dropped out into a conveyor belt to be sorted for drying/pressing when there was a horrid scream. A small newborn baby's body had been discovered tangled up amongst the sheets. It had been cooked. The laundry workers were distraught. The whole place had to be shut down. Police called, and the laundry tracked back to the hospital to discover what happened. It turns out, thankfully in some ways, Stillborn baby had been left in the cot waiting to be taken down to the hospital mortuary after the parents had said their goodbyes and covered it with a blanket, but somehow one of the nurses hadn't realized. Just on shift was the best guess. So just grabbed up all the linen out the cot and off the bed in the delivery room with the body bundled inside and emptied it into the laundry hamper/trolley thing. The other nurses/parents assumed the baby had been collected by the mortuary to be stored awaiting their funeral decisions. The laundry was found not to be to blame, but the parents were devastated and the hospital took a lot of flack. The poor laundry workers who discovered the body ended up being given counseling before eventually quitting. The laundry did amend its practice to individually emptying each laundry hamper into the industrial machines instead of just tipping them in to stop anything like that happening again. My family has a similar story, and I'm pretty sure some of you serial killer buffs out there might figure out who it is before the reveal because their story is pretty unique. When my parents were in college, they went on a trip down to Florida. They had met through mutual friends and were down there together but hadn't gone on a date yet. My dad and one of his friends were planning to meet my mom and some of her friends at a hotel, but being the carefree college guys they lost track of time and realized it was impossible to get to the hotel on time by walking. They decided the best solution to their problem was to hitchhike, and a car with two women picked him up. Everything seemed fine until the driver asked them if it was okay to stop for gas. My dad and his friend agreed it was no problem since they were making good time, and she drove into a gas station. She then pumped her car full of gas before hopping back in and flooring it, basically stealing the gas with two hitchhikers in the back. My dad and his friend were beginning to freak out when she pulled a gun from under her seat and asked, "Are we gonna have a problem?" or something like that. My dad and his friend shook their heads vehemently because what else do you do in that situation? She then drove them to the hotel and dropped them off without so much as a scratch, and they kinda thought nothing of it until the news started reporting on a serial killer in Florida known as Aileen Wuornos. He took one look at her picture and instantly recognized her as the driver. The only reason my dad thinks she didn't straight up kill them was because they were super polite and respectful to her, and her victims were usually scumbag guys trying to take advantage of her. Back in 2009, I went to visit my sister in Pascagoula, Mississippi. I spent a whole week over there. All week long we went to visit casinos, beaches, and a lot of beautiful scenic parks. I used my cell phone to take pictures of the beautiful views, and it was one of those places that I dropped my cell phone by accident and damaged it. So after cursing back and forth, I borrowed my sister's cell phone to call the phone company and ask for a replacement. After a few chit-chats, we finally came to an agreement with the cell phone company, and they decided to deliver a replacement cell phone to my hometown of McAllen, Texas. So in the meantime, I was without a cell phone. On the day of returning home, I arrived and my sister dropped me at the bus station to go buy a ticket for my return home. After purchasing the tickets, I had to wait for the bus to arrive. The first bus trip was from Mississippi to Mobile, Alabama to Louisiana. The trip was in 2 hours. I hated to wait seated for 2 hours before boarding the next bus. After 20 minutes of being seated and bored because I had no cell phone to play at least games, I decided to go get something to eat at a burger stand. After enjoying a delicious meal, I stepped into the bus station's restroom to wash my hands, and that's when my experience started. As I was washing my hands, I glanced through the restroom mirror because a man entered the restroom, and my eyes couldn't deceive what I saw. There standing at the door was a man with the same features. A man resembling me. Another version of me. Thinking it was my mirror reflection, but impossible because my other me was wearing different clothing. I remember I was wearing a yellow t-shirt with a winter black jacket cause it was still cold, and the other me was wearing a green button long-sleeved shirt. Also, he was so shocked that we both stood frozen for a couple of minutes trying to realize everything was real. So after a couple of moments of being frozen in amazement, I decided to break the ice and started to talk. I said, "Hi, who are you?" To where he said the same thing, "Who are you?" We had the same voice. It was as if our voices echoed in the confined restroom space. So I asked his name, and I remember him telling me still in shock. So he also asked me for my name. He assumed I was of Hispanic heritage. I assumed he didn't speak any Spanish. So when we shook hands after introducing ourselves, when we made skin contact, I felt an electric sensation all over my body. After both coming out of the restroom, we started to chat in disbelief that we had just met each other's double. I started to ask him a lot of questions about his descendants and all that stuff. He told me he lived in Maine and came to visit some friends in Alabama. I wanted to take a photo so I could have proof, but we had no cell phone, not even him. So we exchanged information so we could meet at a future date. After chit-chatting a while, we said goodbye with a big hug cause his bus arrived and he departed. I still stayed there waiting for my bus to arrive. I couldn't come out of shock thinking maybe I must have dozed off and dreamed the whole thing, but I had his information on a piece of paper with his number, and once I got home I was to call him. Also, a black man approached me and asked me if he was my twin brother because he said, "Damn, you guys look very alike." I said that I had just run into my double and he walked away in amazement. Finally, my bus arrived and boarded it, so on my way home, I reached into my pocket to take a look at the piece of paper, and to my bad luck, it was gone. How could I have lost such an important thing? When I arrived home, I told my parents about the experience I had, but they had a hard time believing me. I asked my mom if she didn't remember seeing two babies when I was born, and she said she was conscious the whole time she was giving birth to me. So after many years, I wonder if I'll ever see my double again. Shame on me. How could I have lost that important piece of paper? It was May 26th, 2000, and the school year had come to a close. That evening, I was going to the graduation ceremony with my good friend Pat to show some love to our buddies in the class above us. The ceremony itself was like any graduation ceremony in South Texas, long and warm. After the ceremony, we got to chatting with some folks and then decided to get a bite to eat before heading up to Pat's house. I was spending the night because I was helping his family move the next day. Patrick and his family lived out past 107 on 8 Mile. It was pretty far from the school and it was very secluded and dark. They had found a house just around the corner from the school and near civilization. After eating, we headed to Patrick's house. It was a mix of rural neighborhoods and orchards. There was always someone somewhere that claims to have seen a ghost or knew someone that had an episode where they encountered something spooky. On this night, it was nothing out of the usual. It must have been around 9 p.m. or so, and it had been a long day. Patrick and I had been chatted out, I guess, and fell into a quiet spell in the car. Music was playing, and we were just listening to that. I noticed a truck riding my tail in my rear view. I knew he wanted to pass me, but it was a two-lane road, one going north and the other going south. As this truck did so, a car was coming southbound at the same time. It happened fast, and I thought for sure there was going to be a huge accident. But nothing happened. There was no screeching tire sound or loud impact. I checked the rear view and saw the taillights of the car going southbound, but there was no truck. It vanished in that split second. I sat in silence for a moment before looking at Patrick. Maybe I was just tired and making it up, but as I looked at him, he said, "Did you see that?" And we both did a double take in the mirrors. Something did happen, and we couldn't explain it. We sat in silence for a few moments more, trying to process what we had just seen. That truck had to have gone somewhere, but we just don't know where. There was no explanation as to what happened to that truck. The next day, we drove by there again while we were moving furniture from one house to another. We checked for skid marks or wreckage. We checked for some hidden entrance. We tried to make sense of everything, but we just couldn't. I've driven through there several times since, trying to see if I would encounter the same thing again, only to find disappointment. It's been plaguing me to this day. One cold and foggy night many years ago, my wife and I were cruising around due to the fact that we both were on vacation and had a bonus check. That means with money in my pocket, we decided to have a nice road trip. So off we went to visit many places. Since we purchased an atlas and a gas store, we decided to go along and make that road trip. My wife came up with the idea of tracing a circle pattern in the atlas map, so following that circle pattern we went to San Antonio, also went to visit the children of the railroad tracks. After that we went to Marfa, Texas to visit the Marfa lights and so on. After 5 days of a road trip, I was very exhausted from driving. So on our way back home, we decided to drive back at dusk to avoid all the afternoon traffic. So as we were driving back home, night fell upon us, and with almost 3 hours left to get home, we started to get hungry. So I told my wife to start looking for a place to eat. Being almost midnight and cold and almost foggy, we spotted a big neon sign that read, "All night dinner. Anything you can eat for a small price." So I told my wife, perfect, just what we were looking for. My wife got kind of confused and freaked out cause who would have an all-night diner in the middle of nowhere and to the side of the road? At that time, I didn't pay much attention to that cause I was starving and all I wanted was a nice meal. So I just brushed it off. We went inside the diner and got served real good. The waitress was very nice and all got to eat till we got stuffed. Being inside, I noticed the restaurant was a little old style. Nothing like a diner nowadays. Chairs, tables, everything looked outdated. And another weird thing we came to notice after we left the diner was that we were the only ones there. Well, after a nice meal, I got up to pay at the front register, which I found weird cause it was also outdated. It was one of those registers which they pull a lever down and it opens with a bell sound. Thinking maybe it was just part of the restaurant and they wanted to keep everything old-fashioned. I brushed it off, but where in the world would they find an outdated register nowadays? Another weird thing was the waitress had no cell phone and had an old-fashioned hairstyle that nobody uses nowadays. Well, to make a long story short, I took out two $20 bills to pay thinking maybe it was going to be a little expensive, but to our surprise, the whole bill came out to almost $10. I told the cashier if she was sure that was the total since we ate a lot and got stuffed with a lot of food. She said yes, that's the total. As I handed her a $20 bill, I told her to keep the change as a tip, since it was worth it. She couldn't thank us enough since to her it was a very generous tip. So she thanked us and invited us to return whenever we passed by. After we were back on the road, we were so satisfied and happy because of the good customer service we had. Talking of coming back real soon, since it was just like 2 hours from home. 2 weeks later, we decided to pay another visit to that old-fashioned diner. But this time it was during the day. We went, but to our surprise, we drove around back and forth and we couldn't find the diner. We were so dumbfounded cause a couple of weeks earlier the diner was there. There was no way we could have missed it. All we found was the ruins of a very old building. No roof, no windows, just the falling old walls and overgrown grass. I scratched my head thinking maybe I was in the wrong place or town. But no, I was in the right place in town. All we could see was that old building in ruins. So kind of perplexed, I stopped a local and asked about that diner, and the local got shocked and asked us, "How did you know there was a diner here?" And I said, "Wait a minute, what do you mean was?" "Supposedly we ate dinner there a couple of weeks ago." The local said that the place got burned down by a fire more than 40 years ago, and all the workers perished in that fire. I started to shake my head in disbelief and exclaimed to the local that it was not possible since we had a very good meal almost 2 weeks ago. The local said he had proof of he was saying. So he got out his cell phone and opened a news app and searched that diner and showed us where it mentioned the fire and the diner. He also came up with the photos of the people who perished in the fire, and there was the kind waitress who attended us that night. So scared and confused, we thanked the locals for the info, got in the car, and drove out of that town in a hurry. My wife and I were so scared and in shock trying to comprehend the experience we went through. I'm scared cause I remember vividly that night, and no wonder everything seemed outdated. But what happened to us that night? Did we go into a time warp and end up back in time when the diner was in full function? Or did we come face to face with phantoms? This happened back in December 2014. Has anyone had any curiosity of dialing a very old phone number and seeing what happens? Well, my husband had the genius idea of doing that. One Sunday afternoon, dying of boredom, we got the wise idea of doing that. But before doing that, we chatted for quite a while, and he told me that from the years 1982 to 1988, he always called his grandparents over in Reynosa, Mexico, and he always had a long conversation with them. Nowadays, that phone number no longer exists and grandparents are now deceased. I was perplexed that he could remember that number after over 40 years. So just for the fun of it, he grabbed his cell phone and dialed that number to see who it belonged to and talk to whoever owned that number and have a conversation with them. After a few rings, and to my husband's surprise, he recognized the male voice answering at the other end of the line. He had the cell phone on speaker, and I heard the male voice too and asked my husband, "Who is it?" And he turned pale and started to stutter. So the male voice at the other end spoke again. "Hello, who is this? Who you want to talk to?" My husband, all shook up, overcame his impression and answered the male voice and asked the male voice, "Is that you, Grandpa? How is this possible? You've been dead for almost 25 years. My husband told him, "It's me, Grandpa, Joe." And the male voice said, "What kind of joke is this? My little Joe is right here by my side. Who do you want to talk to?" My husband got so dumbfounded and shocked, and by accident hung up the call. Shaking, he explained to me that the male voice was his grandpa, and the background child voice was himself. But how in the world was that possible? It was as if there was a tape recorder playing a recorded tape from many years ago. So after my husband calmed down, he tried to dial the number again, but to his surprise, operator came on stating that the number is disconnected and is no longer in service. So now my husband tries to use boredom a whole different way. I grew up in Texas. I was around 7 or 8 at the time this occurred, and I've never heard of anyone having a similar experience. It was maybe 2 or 3 in the morning, and I was sleeping on the couch in the living room at my parents' home. What woke me up at that time was a very loud moaning sound coming from outside the house. But it wasn't from a single source, it was a lot of loud voices doing the same sound. I got up to peek outside, still laying on the couch, which was next to the window. What I saw is very difficult to explain. So the easiest way to say it is I saw 100s, possibly 1,000s of ghosts all screaming like the hounding wind, but multiplied. They were all going in the same direction, west, and I was looking at them out the window as they went towards my left. They looked like empty, white plastic bags from the grocery store, all floating upside down next to each other, only a little bigger, and were fading when you looked at where their legs were supposed to be, looking like maybe a tethered sheet is the closest I can resemble. They were moving fast, maybe 30 or 40 miles an hour, or faster, like it was a highway. A highway of ghosts passing by our house, across all the way to my neighbor's house. It scared me bad that I quickly laid back down, covered myself with the blanket, and I don't know how I went back to sleep, but I did. The next day, I woke thinking I imagined it, or that it was a nightmare. So, I kind of blew it off. About a week or two later, it was the weekend, and I went to spend the night at my sister's house to hang out with my nephew, who was a year younger than me. We played outside, played video games, all that stuff you do when you're a kid at a sleepover. But that night, at about the same time, the same sound woke me up. I was sleeping in his room, and his bed was next to the window, so I just looked out and saw them again. They were all screaming again. Everything was the same except they were headed northwest this time, and I was looking at them go away from me. I thought to myself, I'm going to keep looking this time, and I did for a bit, until I realized that they were moving so fast if one saw me it would be up in my face in a split second because of how fast they were moving. That scared me even more than I was, so I looked away, covered myself, and even though I could still hear them, somehow I went to sleep. After that second incident, I believe there are supernatural occurrences in this world. I've had other sightings, but not like that one. I've never heard anything like that happening anywhere, and it feels like it's possible that's how ghosts move. Most ghost stories I've heard involve one or maybe a few ghosts in a house. Because of all the ones I saw, it was only in a matter of a few seconds or maybe a minute or two. Maybe that's what happens to ghosts when they aren't in a single location. I don't know, but I wish there was more information on this supernatural event because I've found none.